940 paces. That was the length of the Queen's Mile from the cathedral steps to the Harrowgate gates, and I had counted every one of them so many times that I could walk the whole route in my head with my eyes shut, curb by curb, drain by drain, and tell you where the road narrowed and where it opened, where the wind came off the river, and where the sun would be at 9:30 on a Jubilee morning. I could tell you the 2 places on the whole mile where a thing could go badly wrong. And I could tell you that of those 2 places, the worst by far was the one I was standing in front of when a little girl in a mustard-yellow coat looked at me and pressed her hands together against her chest and would not stop. My name is Edrin Vale. On the morning I am going to tell you about, I was a corporal of the King's Guard of Eldermoor, 38 years old, and the senior man posted at the keeper's turn. The tight left-hand kink 2/3 of the way up the Queen's Mile, where the old street bends around the shoulder of the keeper's house, and the whole processional route squeezes from a broad avenue down to a throat of cobbles barely wide enough for a carriage and its outriders to pass. Every other stretch of the mile is generous. The keeper's turn is mean. It is the one place where the crowd on both sides comes close enough to reach, where the barriers stand nearest the wheels, where a bolting horse has nowhere to go but into the people or into the wall. The Office of Ceremonies had tried for years to widen it and never could, because the keeper's house on the corner is older than the monarchy, and no one is permitted to take a stone off it. So instead they posted a guard there who knew the throat cold. For the last 6 years, that guard had been me. I want to be honest about the shape of this story before I tell it, because the shape is the whole point. I did not stop the Silver Jubilee parade because a child looked at me. Children look at me all day. It is half the job to be the still red statue the small ones stare at, and the tired ones photograph, and the brave ones dare each other to touch. If I broke my post for every child who looked at me, I would never have finished a single ceremony in 14 years. I stopped the parade because of what the child showed me, and to understand what she showed me, you have to understand 3 things first. The throat of the keeper's turn, and what a King's Guard's stillness actually costs, and a girl named Wren who could not hear a single note of the founding hymn, but saw the one thing on that whole mile that everyone with working ears had missed. Start with the stillness, because people misunderstand it, and the misunderstanding is where the drama lives. They think the hard part of my work is not moving. They see the bearskin and the level eyes and the rifle at the order, and they think the discipline is the freeze, the way I can take a tourist shout, a camera flash an inch from my face, a rude poke at my sleeve, a whole coach party chanting to make me smile and give them nothing, nothing at all. And it is true that the freeze takes learning. In your first year it is agony. Your calves cramp and your nose itches and every instinct in your body screams to shift your weight, and you learn to override all of it until stillness stops being a thing you do and becomes a thing you are. But by your 5th year the freeze is easy. By your 5th year the freeze is rest. The hard part is not the not moving. The hard part is the judgment underneath the not moving, the constant, silent, invisible weighing of when the stillness is the duty and when the stillness is the failure. Because the rules that hold me still are not there to turn me into furniture. They are there because 99 times out of 100, the still man is the right man, and the man who lunges at every sudden shout and every fast movement in a crowd is a danger to the very thing he guards. The rules are right almost always. The whole terror of the work is the 100th time. The one morning when the still thing is the wrong thing, and everything in your training is telling you to hold, and something older than your training is telling you to move, and you have 4 seconds to know which voice is God. I had heard the older voice exactly twice in 14 years before the Jubilee. Both times I had been right to listen. I will tell you about one of them later, because it belongs to this story, and because it is the reason I did not look away from the girl. For now, only know this. A King's Guard who has learned to trust the freeze has, without meaning to, half-taught himself never to break it, and the not breaking can kill people just as dead as the wrong break. That is the knife I stood on at the keeper's turn. That is the knife the whole morning turned on. Now the throat. The Silver Jubilee marked 25 years since Queen Saralind came to the throne of Eldermoor, and there is no royal in living memory the people love the way they love Saralind. She is a good queen, genuinely, unfashionably good, the kind of good that costs her something. She could have ridden the Jubilee route in a closed and armored coach with smoked glass, and no one would have thought less of her. Instead she rode it in the open, in the great silver and gray state landau, with the prince consort Aldrich beside her, and behind them in a second open carriage, the two children of the house, Prince Joran, who was 10 and had ridden in enough processions to wave like a professional, and Princess Malin, who was 8 and still found the whole business terrifying and wonderful in equal measure, and gripped the carriage rail with both small hands. A crown that hides from its own people on the one day they came to see it, the Queen said once, is a crown not worth the wearing. So she rode in the open, which meant she rode through the throat of the keeper's turn in the open at a walk, close enough to touch, with her children in the carriage 20 feet behind her. I had walked the throat at 4 that morning in the dark with the route master and a lantern the way I walked it every ceremony. I checked the cobbles for a raised stone. I checked the 2 drains for a loose grating. I checked the barriers, the anchor pins, the bolts on the crowd control rails. I checked the keeper's house itself, the ancient blind wall on the inside of the bend, its one low door, its single high window shuttered as it had been shuttered my whole life. All sound, the barriers pinned, the drains flush, the stones tight. I signed the route master's card at 4:10 and took my post as the sky went from black to gray to the hard, clean gold of an autumn morning off the river, and the crowd came in behind the barriers 4 deep, then 6, then a wall of coats and breath and lifted phones the whole length of the mile, 500,000 strong, and I stood in the throat and became the rock, and waited for the Queen. And at the very front of the crowd, jammed against the iron at the tightest point of the bend, no more than a dozen feet from my boots, stood a small girl in a mustard-yellow coat who was not waving. I noticed her the way you notice a wrong note in music you have heard 1,000 times. Along the whole rail of the throat, every child was doing the one thing children do at a parade, waving, leaning out over the barrier, both arms going, shouting at the outriders jumping to see. A bright ragged line of small hands the length of the street, back and forth, like a field of reeds in a wind that blows one way. And in the middle of that field, one child stood dead still, square to the road, both flat hands pressed against her chest, chin lifted, looking not at the horses and not at the band and not yet at me, but up and across, past me, at the blind old wall of the keeper's house, with an expression on her small face that I had seen exactly twice before in my life, and both of those times had been on the faces of grown men in a very bad hour. It was the face of someone who has understood something terrible before anybody has told her she is allowed to. I kept my eyes level. Of course I did. A child with a solemn face is not a reason to break a march. I let her sit at the edge of my vision the way you let a thing sit when you have not yet decided what it is. The head of the procession was coming. I could hear it far down the mile, the first brass note of the founding hymn, and the long rolling roar as the crowd by the cathedral saw the Queen step off. I let the girl be a wrong note held in the corner of my ear, and I waited, and I watched the throat, and I did not yet know that the small, still girl in the yellow coat was the only person on the entire Queen's mile who was looking at the right thing. The head of the procession reached the keeper's turn at 9:19. The household cavalry came first, 2 by 2 on the big blacks, the steel of their breastplates throwing the broken gold light back into the crowd, and the whole street leaned out to see them, and the roar that had been building down the mile arrived at my throat like weather. I did not move. The horses came through the tight bend at a slow, collected walk, the outriders' knees a hand's breadth from the barriers, and the crowd pressed the iron, and every child on the rail waved harder, screaming with delight, every child but one. The girl in the yellow coat had not moved a muscle. She stood square, both flat hands pressed to her chest, and as the cavalry passed she turned her head slowly to follow them, and I understood, watching her follow them, that she was not watching them the way the other children were. The other children watched the horses to love them. She watched the horses the way you watch a fire that is too close to the curtains. Then the cavalry was through, and the band came behind them, and here is the thing I noticed next, and it is the thing that first turned my blood, though I did not yet know why. When the band came level with the throat, the great bass drum hit its beat, that huge, chest-punching boom that you feel in your ribs before you hear it in your ears, and every soul on that rail flinched or laughed or covered a small one's ears. The whole crowd moved with the drum, a ripple of bodies the length of the street, and the girl in the yellow coat did not react to the drum at all. Not a flinch, not a blink. The biggest sound on the Queen's Mile went off 10 feet from her small body, and she did not so much as turn her head toward it, because she went on watching the blind wall of the keeper's house, and the low door in it, with that same terrible grown-up stillness, as though the loudest thing in the world had not happened at all. I have a niece. Her name is Mara, my sister's girl, and she was born deaf, and I have spent 14 years of Sunday afternoons learning to speak to her with my hands the way she speaks to me with hers. I know the particular stillness of a person who lives inside quiet. I know how a deaf child holds herself in a loud world, how the noise that swings every other head leaves her untouched, so that in a flinching crowd she is the one still point, watching, always watching, because her eyes do the work that everyone else's ears do for them. I knew that stillness the instant the drum failed to move the girl in the yellow coat. She was not ignoring the band. She could not hear the band. She had never heard the band. And she was watching the low door of the keeper's house with her whole self, because her eyes had found something on that quiet corner that 500,000 pairs of working ears had walked straight past. That was the first cold finger down my spine. Not the signal came after. The first thing was simply this. The one person at the throat of the keeper's turn who could not be distracted by the greatest spectacle in the kingdom was staring at the one part of the throat that nobody else was looking at. And then she looked at me. She had been watching the door. Now slowly she brought her eyes off the wall and put them on me, and she found my face under the bearskin, and she did not smile the way children smile when they finally get a guard to look at them. She fixed on me. She held me. And then, keeping her eyes locked on mine, she lifted both flat hands off her chest, held them up before her and pressed them firmly together, palm to palm, and then pushed them down and out, low, a short, sharp shove of both hands toward the ground, and then brought them back to her chest and pressed them there again and would not move. She did it again, hands up, pressed flat together, pushed down and out, back to the chest, held, her eyes never left me. I felt the hair rise on my arms inside the red wool, because I knew that sign. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to make it more than it was. I am not a fluent signer. I know a household's worth of it, the words a man learns to talk to a beloved niece over 14 years of Sundays. But there are signs you cannot mistake, and one of the very first signs Mara ever taught me, because it is one of the first signs any deaf child learns, because it is one they need, is the flat-handed press down and out that means plainly and urgently stop. Not wait, not look, stop. The hands go flat, they meet, they push down against the thing that is coming, and the whole small body behind them leans into it. It is the sign a deaf child makes when the world is about to do something she cannot shout to prevent. The girl in the yellow coat was signing stop at me, deliberately, over and over, with her eyes locked on the one man at the throat with a rifle and the authority to do it, because some sense in her had worked out, in the way frightened children work things out, that I was the man whose whole reason for standing there was to stop things. And she was using the only language she had, the only one that had ever reached anyone, to tell me to use it. Stop what? Every reasonable voice I owned answered at once in the patient tones of every instructor I had ever had. She is copying you, they said. She has seen the changing of the guard, she is playing soldiers. She has made a shape with her hands, and you sentimental fool, you are reading 14 years of Sundays into it. Children mirror. Children sign at deaf uncles all day. The throat is sound, you walked it at 4. The card is signed. There is no danger here for a child to see. You are about to be in front of the crown and 500,000 people, veil, and you cannot break your post because a small girl is making shapes with her hands. The worst thing a guard can do is mistake his own fondness for a warning. Hold. And underneath all of that, in the older part of me, the part that had heard the older voice twice in 14 years and been right both times, something cold and level said, "Look where she was looking before she looked at you." She was not born knowing the word stop matters to a man in red. She learned somewhere in some other bad moment of her small life that when you cannot make a sound and something is wrong, you find the person whose job is to stop it, and you make the sign with your whole body until he sees. She is not playing. She is not mirroring. She has found the one thing wrong on this corner, and she has found the one man who might be able to stop it, and she is spending everything she has to put the two together before the horses come. So I did the thing I had told myself I would not do. I let my eyes leave her, one controlled movement, level still, just a flick, and I followed the line she had been staring down before she fixed on me, past my own shoulder, across the throat, to the blind old wall of the keeper's house on the inside of the bend, and the low door in it, and the man standing in the shadow of that door with his flat cap pulled low, and his hands cupped together at his chest, doing the one thing on that whole loud, bright, waving street that nobody but a silent little girl had thought to watch. And I saw nothing wrong. I want to be honest about that, because the honesty is the whole reason this is a story about discipline and not just about luck. At a glance, in the broken gold light, with the bunting snapping and the band's brass ringing off the walls of the throat, the man in the door looked like exactly what a man in that door should look like. The keeper's house is not empty. There is a caretaker, an old fellow named Sarn who has kept the corner for 30 years, and on ceremony days a groundsman or two from the office of ceremonies is stationed at the low door to keep it shut and keep the crowd off the ancient stone. A man in a gray coat and a flat cap standing in the door of the keeper's house on Jubilee morning was the least remarkable thing on the Queen's Mile. If I had seen him without the girl, I would have taken him for one of Sarn's men and never looked twice. But I did not see him without the girl. I saw him along the line of a silent child's stare, and so I saw him the way she saw him, not as furniture but as a question. And once he was a question, the answers started coming wrong. The first wrong answer: he was not watching the parade. Every other soul on that corner, groundsmen included, had their faces turned to the road, to the horses, to the coming queen. His face was turned down and in, to his own cupped hands. The greatest spectacle in the kingdom was passing 8 feet from him, and he had not looked at it once. The second wrong answer: I did not know him. I know Sarn's men. I have stood the keeper's turn for 6 years. I know the caretaker and his nephew and the 2 regular groundsmen the office sends, by their faces if not their names, the way you come to know the fixtures of a place you guard. This man was not one of them. He was a stranger in the one doorway on the throat that strangers are not permitted to stand in. And the third wrong answer, the one that turned the cold finger on my spine into a cold hand: the low door of the keeper's house was open behind him, standing open, a hand's width but open, and I had checked that door at 4 that morning and found it shut and barred, the way it is always shut and barred, the way it has been shut and barred on every ceremony morning of my 6 years. Someone had opened a door that is never opened, and a stranger was standing in it with his back half to the road and his hands cupped to his chest, and a deaf child 12 feet away was spending her whole small self trying to tell the one man with a rifle that something on this corner was about to go very wrong. I still did not know what was in his hands. I want to be exact about the order of things, because the order is the whole story, and the order is this: I did not yet know the danger. I knew only that every single thing about that man was wrong, that a child who could not be fooled by noise had picked him out of 500,000 people, and that the Queen's open landau was, by the change in the crowd's roar, now 400 paces down the mile and coming. Then the man moved his hands, and I saw the thing in them, and the whole morning went very quiet inside me, the way it goes quiet just before you have to do a hard thing. It was small. A dark object no bigger than a fist, held in both cupped hands the way you hold a bird you do not want to crush, and running from it, down and out of sight into the shadow of the low door, a thin dark line, a cord, a lead. I could not see where it went. But I did not need to see where it went, because I knew this corner, and I knew the one fact about this corner that the Office of Ceremonies and 500,000 spectators did not know and had no reason to know, and that a stranger with a grievance and a gray cap had apparently taken the trouble to learn. The one thing you cannot fix about the keeper's turn is the horses. Not the cobbles, not the drains, not the barriers. Those I can check and pin and sign for. The thing you cannot fix is that the throat is so tight, and the walls so close, and the sound so trapped between the old stone of the keeper's house and the high houses opposite, that a horse coming through it walks through a wall of noise with no room to spare on either side. Every horse in the household is trained for it. They are trained for the drum, for the crowd, for the flags and the flashes. They are calm, brave, and patient beasts, and they carry the crown through the throat at a walk every ceremony without so much as flicking an ear. But there is one thing they are not trained for, because you cannot train for a thing that is never supposed to happen, and it is the one thing that will send even the steadiest carriage horse straight up and over. A sudden, close, high, wrong sound, at the exact moment the beast is boxed in with nowhere to run. A shriek, a whistle at a pitch it has never heard. A sound that its whole body reads below thought, as the sound of a thing that hunts it, fired off a foot from its head, in the tightest, most trapped, most walled-in 40 feet of the entire route, with the Queen in the carriage and her children in the carriage behind, and the crowd pressed so close to the wheels that a plunging, bolting team would have nowhere on God's earth to go but into the people or into the wall. That was what a stranger stood ready to do in the door of the keeper's house. That was the thing a silent child had seen and I had not. Not a bomb, not a blade, something quieter and crueler and far harder to stop, because there is nothing on a man's hands to catch, no weapon to wrestle, just a small dark object and a thin cord and the animal terror of a boxed horse, aimed like a rifle at the narrowest point of the Queen's own road. He did not need to touch the Queen. He only needed to make her horses do the rest. The girl pressed her flat hands together and shoved them down and out, and held them and looked at me. Stop! I had, by the roar of the crowd, perhaps 90 seconds before the Queen's open landau, entered the throat of the keeper's turn. And I was a corporal of the King's Guard, frozen at attention, with no order to move, in front of the crown and the whole realm, staring at a stranger doing a thing I could not prove, that I had pieced together out of an open door, and a cupped hand, and the eyes of a child who could not say a single word to confirm it. The freeze held me. God help me, it held me. You have to understand what the freeze is fighting against, and what it is fighting for, both at once, or you cannot understand why a good man stands still for even 1 second while a stranger primes a horror 12 feet away. The freeze was not cowardice. The freeze was the accumulated weight of every day I had been right to hold, every drunk who screamed in my face and wanted me to swing at him, every prankster who faked a lunge to make me break, every fast movement in a crowd that turned out to be a dropped hat or a fainting tourist or a boy chasing a balloon. A guard who breaks his post at every wrong-looking thing is not a guardian. He is a liability who empties the wrong street and turns his back on the real one. The freeze had been right 10,000 times. It is a terrible thing to have been right 10,000 times, because the 11,000th time, when you must be wrong on purpose, the whole weight of your rightness is standing on your chest telling you to hold. And there was the other weight, the private one, the one I am not proud of. If I broke my post, if I came out of the freeze and moved on that stranger and halted the Queen's own parade at the throat of the keeper's turn, in front of the crown and 500,000 people and every camera in the realm, and I was wrong, and the man in the door was one of Sarn's groundsmen holding a coil of rope and a torch, then I was finished. Not reprimanded. Finished. I would be the guard who stopped the Silver Jubilee, who charged a workman, who made the Queen's carriage stand in the street while the realm watched, because a little girl waved her hands at him and he lost his nerve. 14 years of service would end as a joke told in the mess for the next 40. My honor, my name, my niece watching on the television, all of it, spent on a cord that turned out to be a bootlace. That was the cost of moving and being wrong. It was enormous. I felt every ounce of it. But here is the arithmetic they teach you when they teach you to guard a life and not just a gate, and it is the arithmetic that saved the morning, and it is not faith, and it is not a hunch, and it has nothing to do with the sweetness of a child's face. It is cold, and it is simple, and it goes like this. Weigh the 4 corners. If I hold and I am right, if the man is nothing and the girl is only playing, the cost is nothing. A pretty morning. A signal I think about for a week and forget. If I move and I am wrong, if the man is nothing and I break my post for it, the cost is my career, my honor, my name, everything I am. A thing I would have to pay and pay dearly, but a thing that can be paid. Ruin is survivable. Men survive ruin. I would still be alive to be ashamed. If I move and I am right, I stop it. Whatever it is, it does not happen. The cost is a delayed parade and a great deal of explaining, and it is the cheapest of the 4 corners by a mile. And if I hold and I am wrong. I made myself finish that thought, because you must finish it, because the not finishing of that thought is exactly how good men end up standing still while the worst happens. If I held, and the man was what every wrong thing about him said he was, then in 90 seconds a boxed team of horses would go straight up in the tightest 40 feet on the route, and a bolting carriage would go into the crowd or into the wall, with the Queen in it and 30 feet behind her in the second open carriage, a boy of 10 and a girl of 8, and a rail of children on both sides, one of them in a mustard-yellow coat, pinned against the iron with nowhere to run. That was the 4th corner. That was the cost of my honor, if I chose to spend the morning protecting it. The arithmetic is not close. It is not even a calculation once you lay the 4 corners out. When one side of the ledger is your name and the other side is a bolting team in a walled throat full of penned children, there is no sum in the world in which your name is the heavier thing. A man who thinks his honor outweighs them has not understood what his honor is for. My honor was not a thing to protect. My honor was the horses not bolting. My honor was the girl in the yellow coat going home for her supper. If I spent my career to buy that, then my career had finally been spent on the one thing it was ever for. I had heard the older voice twice before. I promised I would tell you one of the times, and this is the moment for it, because it is the reason I did not need the full 90 seconds to decide. 6 years earlier, my second winter on the keeper's turn, a woman at the barrier had fainted. That happens. People lock their knees and stand for hours and go down. But this woman did not go down the way fine turs go down, loose, folding. She went down stiff, and her hand went to her chest, not her head, and the crowd around her laughed and thought she was clowning for the guard. And every instinct I had said, hold your post. It is not your business. The marshals will handle the crowd. And the older voice, the level cold one, said her hand is on her chest and her lips are gray and no one else has seen it. I broke my post. I broke it for a fainting woman while 30 people laughed, and I got to her before her heart finished stopping, and I kept it going with my 2 hands on the cobbles until the ambulance men took over, and she lived. And to this day, the marshals who laughed do not know how close that laugh came to being the last sound she heard. I was very nearly disciplined for leaving my post. The report said I had used my judgment correctly. I have never forgotten the size of the gap between those 2 sentences. How narrow the ledge is between the guard who is commended and the guard who is broken, and how the only thing that decides which one you are is whether the thing you saw was really there. So I knew the ledge. I had stood on it before. And standing on it again at the throat of the keeper's turn, with a stranger's cupped hands 12 feet away and a silent child spending her whole self to warn me, I made my decision, and I made it the way you are supposed to make it, not on certainty, because I had no certainty, but on the arithmetic of the four corners. I could pay for being wrong. No one could pay for my being right, and still I was going to treat the child as right, because the price of treating her as wrong was a price no one on that street could afford. I broke the freeze. But I want to tell you how I broke it slowly, because it happened fast and the order is everything, and because the wrong break would have been as deadly as no break at all. I did not run at the man. A running guard is a panic, and a panic moves a crowd, and a moved crowd pressed against the barriers of that throat would have surged the iron and done the horses terror for them. I did the opposite of running, and the first thing I did before I took a single step was answer the girl, because she had spent everything she had to reach me, and a warning heard must be answered, or the one who gave it does not know it landed, and a child who thinks her warning failed will do something desperate. I looked her dead in the eye, and I brought my white-gloved right hand up off the small of my rifle, flat, and I signed back the only word that mattered, the word she had taught me across 12 feet of cobbles in the space of a minute, the word that was hers before it was ever mine. I signed, I see. I do not know a great deal of the language, but I know that. Mara taught it to me the first winter, because it is the thing a deaf child most needs to be told and most rarely is, not yes, not good. But I see you, I have understood, the message landed. Flat hand, fingers to the eyes, and then turned out toward the other person. I see. I threw it across the 12 feet of cobbles between us, and I watched it land on the girl in the yellow coat, and I will remember what her face did for the rest of my life. It was not relief. It was too big for relief. It was the face of a child who has been shouting into a void with no sound in her throat, who has watched every adult in the world turn away, and who has just, for the first time, been answered. Her whole small body sagged an inch against the rail, and then, because she was a brave and serious girl, and braver than I understood yet, she did not celebrate. She lifted her hands and signed to me again fast, and this time it was not stop. It was a sign I did not fully know, an urgent flurry, and then she jabbed one small finger once hard down and to the side at the low door at the cord at the ground. She was not just telling me to stop. She was telling me where. She was telling me the danger was not the man but the thing on the cord, and the thing on the cord was low, was down, was on the ground behind the door. A child who could not hear was giving me a targeting report, and doing it better than half the trained men I have served with, because she had been watching that corner with her whole attention since before I ever noticed her, and she had worked out the shape of it while the rest of us watched the horses. I gave her one small nod. Then I went to work, and I went to work quietly, because the whole trick of the next 60 seconds was to stop the thing without starting a panic, and a king's guard has more tools for that than the crowd will ever know. The first tool is the drill. On a ceremony route, the guards and marshals are not alone. We are a nervous system. At the throat of the keeper's turn, I was the senior post, but 40 feet up the mile, at the mouth of the bend, where the cavalry escort forms up to bring the carriages through, stood the route master's marshal, and mounted just behind him, the escort sergeant, the hard, careful man whose whole job at that bend is to watch the throat and read the crossing before he brings the Queen's horses into it. His name was Harrowgate Dunmore, 22 years in the household cavalry, a man I had stood 100 ceremonies beside and never once heard raise his voice. If I could reach Dunmore, I could stop the carriages before they ever entered the throat, and I could do it without a single shout, because Dunmore and I shared the old dismounted signals the way two men who have worked a dangerous corner for years come to share a private grammar. I came out of the order arms in one clean motion, heels together, rifle brought up in a cross, and I threw the halt signal up the mile toward the bend. Flat hand high, held, then chopped down. Halt and stand fast. It is a signal exactly 4 men on that stretch were trained to read and obey without a word or a question, and Dunmore was the first of them, and his eyes, as I knew they would be, were already on the throat. And here the morning did the thing that mornings do when they mean to test you all the way to the floor. Because in the half-second before Dunmore's eyes found my raised hand, the band came level with the bend, the great brass ranks, 40 players and the drums, and passed between us. 40 feet of moving musicians, plumes and bells and the bass drum swinging, filled the gap between my post and Dunmore's like a curtain drawn across a window. He could not see my hand. I could not see his face. The one man on the mile I most needed to reach was blotted out behind a wall of marching brass at the exact moment I reached for him, and there was nothing to do but stand with my arm up in the halt and wait for the band to clear, and count the paces of the Queen's landau and the roar of the crowd. 300 now, still coming, while a stranger crouched at a cord 12 feet away, and a curtain of trombones hid my only ally. That was the midpoint of the morning, and it changed the game entirely, and I felt it change. Up to that second my plan had been clean. Reach Dunmore, halt the carriages up the mile, deal with the man at leisure while the Queen waited safely out of the throat. Simple, correct. The plan a disciplined man makes. And the band took it from me in a single stride. When the brass finally cleared and I could see the bend again, 2 things had happened, and both were bad. Dunmore had lowered his eyes to his own horse to steady it through the drum. He had missed my signal entirely and was now looking away, bringing the escort up, which meant the carriages were coming on. And the man in the door of the keeper's house had lifted his head off his cupped hands and was no longer looking down. He was looking at me. He had seen me break my post. Of course he had. I had come out of the freeze and thrown my arm up the mile and stood there signaling like a man on fire, 12 feet from him, and even a man lost in his own dark work will notice when the red statue beside him suddenly comes alive. Our eyes met across the throat, mine level under the bearskin, his in the shadow of the flat cap, and I watched him understand, the way I had watched the fainting woman's gray lips 6 years before, that I knew. That the one man on the corner who was never supposed to move had moved, and had moved because of him. And I saw him make his own arithmetic, faster than I liked. A patient man in his position would have slipped the object back into his coat, closed the door, and walked away into 500,000 people, and I could never have proved a thing, and the Queen would have passed safely, and I would have spent the rest of my life not quite sure. That is what a man with time would have done. But he did not have time, and he knew it, because the carriages were coming and his whole plan lived or died in the next 60 seconds, in the throat, with the horses boxed, and a man who has built his whole grievance toward a single narrow window does not, when he sees the window closing, always choose to be sensible. Some of them choose to be quick. His hand tightened on the object, his thumb moved to the cord. He was going to do it now, early, before the Queen even reached the throat if he had to, because a spooked team of cavalry escort horses in that walled bend would jam it into chaos and bring the whole procession to a plunging, screaming halt right where he wanted it. And even if he could not reach the Queen's own horses, he could turn the throat of the keeper's turn into a crush with 200 penned people and a wall, and call it enough. I was 12 feet away. With a rifle I could not fire into a crowd. A curtain of brass between me and my only ally, a stranger's thumb on a cord, and no more time to be clever. So I stopped being clever. I did not draw, I did not shout. A rifle is useless 12 feet from a stranger with a crowd at his back, and a shout in that throat would have done the man's work for him, spooking the very horses I was trying to save. What I had was distance and speed, and the one advantage a king's guard always has that no one in the crowd ever counts on, because they have spent all morning watching him not move. When the still man finally moves, he is faster than anyone expects, because they have forgotten he can. I crossed the throat. 12 feet is nothing. 12 feet is 2 strides for a man who has spent 14 years keeping his legs strong under a bearskin, and I had covered half of it before the crowd nearest me had even registered that the red statue was running. I dropped the rifle butt off my shoulder as I went. You do not close on a man with a weapon between you. It only gives him something to grab, and I came at him low and hard, not at his body but at his hands, because a silent child had told me the danger was in his hands and on the cord, and I believed her more than I believed my own eyes. He got the thumb press half done. I want to be exact because everything turned on the half. He drove his thumb down on the object as I reached him, and I heard it, not a bang, nothing so simple. A thin, rising, needle-fine shriek, a whistle pitched so high it was almost above hearing, the sound scraping at the top of the air like a fingernail on the inside of your skull. It was the cruelest sound I have ever heard, and it was cruel precisely because it was so nearly nothing. A sound that a man in the crowd would flinch at and forget, but that a horse boxed in a stone throat would read below all thought as the scream of the thing that eats it. I felt it more than heard it. And down the mile at the mouth of the bend, I heard the cavalry escort's horses answer it. A sudden ragged clatter, a squeal, the stamp and lunge of half a ton of frightened animal, and Dunmore's voice at last, sharp and low, steady up, steady, the voice of a horseman fighting his mount. The whistle had been half a second from doing exactly what the man built it to do. And then my gloved hands closed over his, and I clamped the object between his palms and mine and drove the whole mess of it down against his chest, and folded him back into the low doorway with the weight of my body, and the shriek choked off. Not because I found a switch. There was no switch to find, but because I had wrapped my hands so completely around the thing and pinned it so hard to his chest that the little bell of it, the horn, whatever it was, could no longer throw its sound into the throat. It screamed into the wool of his coat and the leather of my gloves and went nowhere. I had not disarmed it. I had smothered it. There is a difference, and the difference nearly killed us both a minute later, but for that first half-second the thing was silenced, and the escort horses at the bend, hearing the shriek stop as suddenly as it began, steadied under their riders, and Dunmore got them still, and the throat did not fill with bolting horses. It looked for one breath, as though it was over. That was the false dawn, and I have learned to distrust false dawns, because the morning was not remotely over. 3 things happened in the next few seconds, all at once, and each one was worse than the last. The first, the man was not finished. A man who has built his whole life toward one narrow window does not stop fighting when a guard folds him into a doorway. He fought me not wildly, but with the desperate, focused strength of someone who has nothing left to lose, twisting the object in our 4 clamped hands, trying to work even a corner of the horn free of my gloves so the shriek could find the air again. He was strong. Grief and grievance make a man strong. And I could not simply overpower him and be done, because if my grip slipped for even an instant, the sound would leap back out into the throat, and I had felt what half a second of it did to the horses at the bend. I had to hold the thing smothered and hold him pinned and do both perfectly, in a doorway with a crowd screaming behind me, and I had only 2 hands. The second the crowd had seen, of course they had seen. A guard had broken from his post and charged a man in a doorway, and the 2 of them were now wrestling against the ancient wall of the keeper's house 12 feet from the barrier. And the people nearest the throat had begun to do the thing crowds do, to surge, to press, to cry out, a ripple of alarm running back up the rail in both directions. And a surging crowd at the throat of the keeper's turn was its own disaster, penned 200 deep against iron barriers with a stone wall behind and nowhere to go, exactly the crush the man had hoped to make with his horses. I had stopped one catastrophe, and was in danger of starting another with my own body. And the third, the worst, the carriages were still coming. Because Dunmore had missed my signal. Because the band had drawn its curtain across us at the one moment that mattered. Down at the mouth of the bend, the escort sergeant had steadied his spooked horses, and seeing them settle, had read the whole thing as a passing fright, a firecracker, a dropped tray, the ordinary noise of a jubilee, and had waved the column on because that is his job, to keep the queen moving, and no man had told him otherwise. The queen's open landau, with the prince consort beside her, and the children's carriage 30 feet behind, had rounded into the approach to the throat and was coming on at a walk, 200 paces, coming into the very stretch I had cleared the man's horses from, and I was pinned in a doorway with a struggling stranger and a smothered horn, unable to raise a hand, unable to shout a warning that would not itself panic the horses, watching the silver and gray carriage come toward the throat where, if the shriek got free for even 1 second while the queen's own team was boxed inside it, everything I had done would be for nothing. I had smothered the sound. I had not stopped the parade, and the parade was walking straight into the throat. I remember thinking with a strange flat clarity that I had solved the wrong half of the problem. I had gone for the man's hands, as the girl told me, and I had been right to, but stopping the man was only ever half of it. The other half was stopping the queen. And the one thing I had needed to do that, reach Dunmore, halt the carriages up the mile, I had lost to a wall of trombones, and I could not do it now, because I could not let go of the horn, because the instant I let go, the horn would sing and the queen's team would go up in the throat with the queen inside it. I was out of hands, I was out of time, I was out of every clever thing. And a small voice, close by at the barrier, did the last thing I would ever have asked a child to do, and the bravest. Except it was not a voice because she had no voice to use. It was better than a voice. It was the girl in the yellow coat, and she had understood from 12 feet away, with no way to hear a single thing that had happened, reading the whole disaster off our bodies the way she read everything with her eyes, that the man was stopped but the queen was not. She had watched me go for his hands. She had watched the carriages keep coming. And her quick, terrible, clear mind had leapt the same gap mine had leapt and landed on the same answer. The guard is out of hands, so someone else must reach the horsemen. She could not reach them with a shout. But she had done the impossible arithmetic of a deaf child in a hearing world her whole life, how to move a person you cannot call to, and she did the only thing that could work. She turned from me to the grown-ups packed at the rail around her, and she made herself impossible to ignore. I saw it out of the corner of my eye while I fought the man in the doorway. She grabbed the sleeve of the nearest adult, a big man in a green anorak, a stranger, someone's father, and she hauled on it with both hands and pointed, hard, up the mile at the coming carriages, and then down at me wrestling in the door, back and forth, her whole small body a single furious arrow, her mouth open in the shape of a word she could not make. And the man in the green anorak, who had been filming the queen on his phone like everyone else, looked where the child was hauling him to look, and saw a king's guard pinning a stranger in a doorway, and saw the queen's carriage walking toward the throat, and God bless the ordinary decency of ordinary people. He understood enough. He did not understand what the object was, or the cord, or the horn. He understood that a guard was fighting to stop something, and a little girl was screaming without sound for someone to help, and that was enough for a decent man to act on. He cupped his hands and he roared up the mile with a voice like a foghorn, "Stop the horses! Stop, stop the parade!" And the man beside him took it up, and the woman beside her, and it went up the rail faster than any signal I could have thrown. A wave of 200, 500, 1,000 voices, all shouting the same thing at the horsemen at the bend. Stop! Stop the parade! A crowd that a minute ago had been surging in alarm now turned, by one deaf child's furious pointing, into a single instrument aimed straight at the escort sergeant's ears. Harrowgate Dunmore, 22 years in the household cavalry, heard 1,000 people scream stop the horses at the mouth of a throat he had just brought the queen's own carriage toward, and he did not need to understand it either. A crowd does not scream that with one voice for nothing. He threw up his arm and rained the whole column dead. And the parade stopped. I felt it happen more than I saw it, because my hands were full of a fighting stranger, But you cannot mistake it, the change in the roar. The great slow forebeat of the carriage horses breaking off into the stamp and blow of a halted team. The band, who had marched on ahead through the throat and out the far side, playing 3 more bright bars of the founding hymn over the top of a mile gone suddenly, strangely still behind them. Before the bandmaster felt the death of the column at his back and dragged the hymn to a ragged, trailing stop, the Queen's open landau came to a stand 40 feet short of the throat of the keeper's turn. She never entered it. She sat in the clean, broad part of the mile with the prince consort beside her, and 30 feet behind, the children's carriage stood with Prince Joran half risen to see what had happened, and Princess Malin's small face turned toward the commotion. And none of them, not the Queen, not the consort, not the boy, not the girl, ever came within 40 feet of the box throat where a stranger had built his morning to kill a team of horses. That is the moment the whole story turns on, and I want to be honest about who turned it. I did not stop the Silver Jubilee. I stopped a man. A big kind stranger in a green anorak stopped the horses with his foghorn voice, and Harrowgate Dunmore stopped the column with his raised arm. But the person who stopped the parade, the one without whom every one of us would have been staring at the horses while the throat filled with catastrophe, was a girl of 7 in a mustard-yellow coat who could not hear the band, who saw the one wrong thing on the whole mile, who spent everything she had to put it into the eyes of the one man with a rifle, and who, when that man ran out of hands, reached past him and turned 500,000 strangers into her voice. She stopped the parade. I only did what she told me. But the morning still was not over, because I still had a fighting man and a live horn in a doorway, and a smothered thing that would sing the instant I let it go. And now, with the carriages halted and the Queen safe, the man in my hands knew his window had closed, and a man whose window has closed sometimes decides that if he cannot have the horses he will at least have the noise, the panic, the chaos, the crush at the barrier that he can still make with one shriek if my grip fails for a heartbeat. I felt his last twist coming and I met it. I got my knee up and my shoulder into his chest, and I walked him back through the low door of the keeper's house, off the street, out of the throat, into the dim, cool stone of a room that had not opened its door in 100 ceremonies. And there, away from the horses and away from the crowd, where the shriek could do no harm even if it got free, I finally let myself win the fight instead of only holding it. I bore him down. I got the horn out from between our 4 hands and I opened my gloved fingers over its horn end and let it scream once, harmlessly, into the thick old stone of a room built before the monarchy. A thin needle shriek that no horse could hear, and then I found the little slide on its side with my thumb and I shut it off, and the keeper's house was silent, and the man under me stopped fighting all at once, the way they do when the thing they built their life around is finally, provably over, and lay still on the ancient flags with his flat cap knocked off and his gray face turned to the wall. That was when the other guards reached me, 2 marshals through the low door, then Dunmore off his horse and in at a run, then more red coats than the throat had ever held, and the man was taken, and I came up off the stone floor of the keeper's house with my bearskin gone and my tunic torn at the shoulder and my white gloves black, and I went back out through the low door into the light to find the first thing I needed to find, which was not the Queen, and was not my commanding officer, and was not the man's cord traced back to whatever he had rigged. It was a small girl in a mustard-yellow coat, to tell her with my hands that it was over, and that she had done it and that I had seen. She was still at the rail. Of course she was. There was nowhere for a small girl to go in a crowd 200 deep, but the crowd around her had changed. The people who had shouted at her furious pointing had understood, in the way a crowd slowly understands, that the little girl in the yellow coat was the reason they had shouted, and a ring had opened around her, the way a ring opens around someone who has done a thing too big for the space they are standing in. The man in the green anorak had a hand on her shoulder, not holding her, just being there, the way a decent stranger stays close to a child who has spent herself down to nothing. And a woman was pushing through toward her from 3 rows back, a young woman with the girl's own dark hair and a face gone white with fear, calling a name I could not hear over the noise. The girl's mother, who had lost her small daughter's hand in the crush at exactly the wrong moment, and had spent the worst 4 minutes of her life fighting through a wall of strangers toward the commotion, not knowing it was her own child at the heart of it. I reached the rail before the mother did. I went down on one knee on the cobbles, a king's guard, in the wreck of his uniform, kneeling at the barrier in front of 500,000 people, and I did not care, and I would do it again, so that my face was level with the girl's face, and I raised my blackened, gloveless hands, because I had lost the white gloves somewhere on the floor of the keeper's house, and I signed to her the only 3 things that mattered. I signed "It is over," I signed "You did it." And then I signed the word she had given me, the word that had started everything, and turned it into the thing I most needed her to know. I brought my flat hand to my eyes and turned it out toward her. I see, I saw, I have understood, and then I put my hand flat on my own chest, over the torn tunic and the racing heart, and I bowed my head to her. Thank you. As low as I have ever bowed to anyone, including the Queen. The girl in the yellow coat looked at my hands, and then she looked at my face, and then she did the thing that undid me, the thing I had not been undone by in 14 years of a job that is built to keep a man from being undone. She reached both her small hands through the iron barrier, and she took my one blackened hand in both of hers, and she held it, and she did not sign anything at all, because some things do not need a language. And her mother reached us then, and got her arms around the child from behind and pressed her face into the yellow wool and shook. And the girl kept hold of my hand through it all, and I knelt on the cobbles in the ruin of my uniform, and let a 7-year-old hold my hand while her mother wept into her hair. And that is a thing they do not put in the drill, and it is the best thing I have ever done at that post or any other. Her name was Wren. Her mother told me later, in the quiet room they gave us, spelling it slowly with her own hand so I could see her daughter's name shaped in the air. Wren Aldous, 7 years old, born deaf, sharp as a blade, who had begged all week to be brought to the Jubilee not to see the Queen but to see the horses, because she loved horses more than anything on earth, because a horse does not need words either, and a girl who lives in quiet understands a creature that speaks with its whole body. She had watched the horses come, and she had watched the man in the doorway, and this is what her mother told me, and it is the thing I carry. She had seen the cord on the ground and the little horn in his hands, and she had known, with the animal certainty of a child who loves horses, that the thing in his hands was made to hurt them. She did not know it was a whistle. She did not know it was pitched for an animal's terror. She only knew, watching him, that he was a man doing a cruel and secret thing to horses, in a doorway, while everyone else looked away, and that she had to stop him, and that the only person who might listen to a girl with no voice was the red man with the rifle who was already, for reasons she could not know, the one man on the mile who could read the word stop off her hands. That is the whole miracle of it, and I have turned it over 1,000 times since. If it had been any other post on the Queen's mile, the guard would not have known her sign, and she would have signed stop into a wall of red wool and been ignored, and the morning would have ended the way the man in the doorway planned. It had to be the keeper's turn. It had to be the guard with the deaf niece and 14 years of Sundays and one flat word of the language, standing at the one throat where the horses could not run. Some men call that luck. I have stood too many dangerous corners to believe in luck. I call it the thing that happens when a good queen rides open through her own people, and a brave child comes to see the horses, and a man has spent his life learning to answer the one voice no one else can hear, and all 3 of them arrive at the same corner at the same minute of the same morning. I do not have a better word for that than grace, and I am not a man much given to the word. As for the man in the gray cap, his name I will give you, because he has been dealt with by the courts of Eldermoor and is no secret, though I will tell you plainly that he is a nobody, and that the smallness of him is the last thing I want you to understand about this morning. He was called Osric Fenn, and he had been for 11 years a farrier's man in the royal mews, one of the people who shoe and tend the household horses, a quiet, skilled, unremarkable man who had loved those animals, genuinely loved them for over a decade. 2 years before the Jubilee, the mews had been reorganized. A contract changed hands, a new stable master came in with new men, and Osric Fenn was let go, not cruelly, not unjustly, just the ordinary grinding way a large institution sheds a small man it has stopped needing. But Fenn did not experience it as ordinary. He experienced it as a theft. The horses had been his family, the mews had been his whole life, and the crown, in his telling of it to himself over 2 bitter years, had taken his family from him and thrown him into the street. He wanted the crown to feel what he had felt. And because he had spent 11 years learning exactly how a household horse thinks, and exactly what will break its trained calm, and exactly where on the Queen's Mile a horse has no room to run, he built himself a small cruel instrument, and a plan to use it at the one throat where it would do the most harm. A plan to make the crown's own beloved horses turn on the crown, in front of the whole realm, the way he believed the crown had turned on him. It was a wicked plan and a clever one, and it very nearly worked, and the thing that beat it was not our security, and not our intelligence, and not me. The thing that beat it was that a man who set out to weaponize the terror of horses was seen through, at the last possible moment, by a small deaf girl who had come to the Jubilee for no other reason than that she loved them. Now I must tell you about the reckoning, because in my service a guard who breaks his post, who leaves his position, who charges a member of the public, who by his own hand brings the Silver Jubilee procession to a halt in front of the crown, does not simply walk away clapped on the back. There are rules, and the rules are not there for nothing, and the same institution that had very nearly disciplined me 6 years before for saving a fainting woman was going to look very hard at what I had done in the throat of the keeper's turn. I stood before an inquiry 2 days later. I will not pretend it was a comfortable room. Facing me across the table sat men whose whole lives, like mine, were the discipline of the guard, the captain of the King's Guard, the master of the household, an officer of the cavalry sent on Dunmore's account, and in a chair to the side, saying nothing for a long time, a gray and level-eyed man who was the Queen's own private secretary. And they asked me, in the flat, careful way such men ask, to account for it. To explain how a corporal of the King's Guard had come to abandon his post and lay hands on a member of the public and stop the Silver Jubilee, on the strength, as one of them put it, not unkindly, but I heard the edge in it of the hand signals of a child. And I told them the truth, which was the 4 corners of the arithmetic. I told them I had not been certain. I told them I had walked the throat at 4 and signed the card and believed the corner sound. I told them what was wrong about the man, the open door, the strange face, the cupped hands, the cord, the head turned from the greatest spectacle in the realm. I told them what I knew about the horses and the throat, the one thing about that corner they could check and would find true. And I told them about the girl, not that she had waved at me, not that she was sweet, but that she was deaf, and therefore could not be fooled by the noise that fooled everyone else, and had been watching the one wrong corner with the one kind of attention no one else on the mile could bring. I told them I had weighed the cost of being wrong against the cost of being still, and found that the cost of being still, if the child was right, was a thing no man could ever repay. And I told them that if they broke me for it, I would understand the rule they were keeping, and I would still, given the same corner and the same child and the same morning, do exactly the same thing again. There was a long silence in that room. And then the gray man in the side chair, the Queen's secretary, who had not spoken once, leaned forward and asked me a single question, and it was not the question I expected. He did not ask me to justify breaking the post. He asked me, "Corporal, when the child signed to you and you signed back, what did you say to her?" I told him. I said I signed I see. I said it was the first thing my own deaf niece had ever taught me, because it is the thing a person who lives in silence most needs to be told and most rarely is, that they have been heard. The gray man sat back. He looked at the other men at the table, and something passed between them that I did not have the rank to read. And he said quietly, "The Queen has asked me to convey to this inquiry that she considers the matter closed, and that she wishes it recorded that the officer used his judgment, and that his judgment was correct." A pause. "She has also asked me to convey something to you personally, Corporal, which is not for the record." He looked at me. "She says, a crown that is guarded only by men who never break their stillness is a crown guarded by statues. She would rather be guarded by men. Thank you for being a man on Tuesday. I have served the House of Harrowgate for 14 years, and I have received 2 commendations and a medal I am permitted to wear, and I will tell you honestly that no ribbon on my chest has ever weighed what those 3 sentences weighed, carried second-hand across a table by a gray man in a plain suit. A crown guarded only by statues is a crown guarded by no one. I have thought about that sentence every morning since, on every post I have stood, and it has changed the way I stand them. The frieze is still my duty, but the frieze is not the whole of my duty, and it never was, and the day I forget the difference is the day I should hang up the bearskin. They did not break me. They did the opposite, though the opposite came quietly, the way real honor comes in the Guard. Not with a parade, we had rather had our fill of parades, but with a line in a record and a handshake from the captain, and some weeks later, a set of corporal's stripes turned into a sergeant's, with no speech attached, which is how the Guard says a thing it means. But I have skipped ahead of the part that matters most, because it is the part that is not about me at all, and I promised myself when I began this that I would not let it become a story about the Guard. It is a story about the girl. So let me go back to the afternoon of the Jubilee, to the quiet room off the palace forecourt where they had taken Wren Aldis and her mother, not to question a 7-year-old, but to keep them safe and warm and out of the crush while the mile was cleared, because something happened in that room that I want you to know, and it is the true end of the story, whatever the inquiry decided about me. The Queen came to that room. She came without ceremony, still in the silver and gray she had worn in the landau, and she came alone but for one lady of the household and me. I had asked to be there, and to my surprise they let me, torn tunic and all, because someone had understood by then that I was the only person in the palace who could speak to the child in her own language, imperfect as my hands were. Queen Saralind is not a tall woman, and she does not fill a room the way you expect a monarch to fill a room. What she does instead is find the smallest person in it and make that person the largest, and she did it now. She did not go to Wren's mother first, though she greeted her kindly. She went to the child. And then she did the thing that I have told my niece about 100 times since, because it is the thing that tells you everything about why the people of Eldermoor love this queen the way they do. She got down. A queen in her state clothes on the floor of a plain room folded herself down onto one knee so that her face was below the face of a 7-year-old girl, and she looked up at Wren Aldis, and she turned to me and she said, "Corporal, teach me. Show me how to say it." And I showed her and she copied me, clumsy and careful, a queen's hands learning a child's word. She brought her flat hand to her eyes and turned it out toward Wren. "I see you." And then she pressed her hand to her own heart, and then she opened both hands toward the girl, and I did not have to translate any of it because Wren was already crying, the silent shaking cry of a child who has been seen all the way down, and the queen gathered her in and held her, on the floor in her state clothes, and did not let go for a long time. When she rose, the queen said one thing aloud to the room, in a voice not quite steady. 25 years I have ridden that road, she said, and I have been guarded by the best men in the realm, and today my life and my children's lives were saved by a girl of 7 who came to see the horses. She looked at Wren, and then at me. The realm will thank the Guard, and it should, but I want it understood in this room that the person who saw was her. We only listened. And she asked Wren's mother whether the family might do her the honor, her word, the honor of being her personal guests at the Mews the following spring, so that Wren might meet the horses she had saved. And she asked it as a favor, not a command, as though a deaf child's yes were the thing that would make the Queen's day, and I believe it was. Wren went to the mews that spring. I know because I took her off duty in a plain coat, the two of us and her mother and a stableman leading out a great patient gray mare, who lowered her enormous head to a small girl in a mustard-yellow coat, and let herself be spoken to in the only language a horse and a deaf child have ever truly needed, which is no language at all, only attention, only the whole body turned toward the other and saying, without a single word, I see you. Wren stood with her hand flat on that mare's warm neck for the better part of an hour, and the mare stood for her, and I stood a little apart and watched them, and I thought about a gray-capped man who had spent his love for horses until it curdled into a plan to make them scream, and a small girl who had spent her love for them to stop him, and I understood that the whole distance between a broken man and a saving child is the direction you point the same love. I am back at the keeper's turn. I stood at the very next ceremony, and I have stood it since, and I will stand it until they retire me. The throat is still mean. You still cannot widen it. The horses still walk through the trapped noise with no room to spare. But something is different about the corner now, and it is not the corner, it is me. I used to stand it as a man guarding a place. I stand it now as a man who knows that the most important warning of his whole life came to him without a sound, from below the height of the barrier, in a language almost no one on that street could speak, and that he very nearly, out of the finest discipline in the realm, held his post and let it pass. So I watch the front of the crowd now. I watch the small ones and the still ones and the ones who are not waving. I have learned the flat word for stop in 3 more of the hand languages of Eldermoor, and I keep learning, because I never again want a child to spend her whole self warning me in a tongue I cannot read. The bearskin is the same, and the rifle is the same, and the frieze is the same, and if you passed me on a ceremony morning, you would see exactly what you have always seen. A red statue, eyes level, a man who does not move. But I am listening now. That is the thing the girl in the yellow coat taught the finest disciplined man on the Queen's Mile, and it is the thing I would leave you with, whoever you are, wherever you stand your own quiet post. The stillness is not the honor. The stillness is only the frame. The honor is knowing the one moment in 10,000 when the still thing is the wrong thing, and being humble enough under all that discipline to be told so by the smallest, quietest voice at the rail. Her name was Wren. She could not hear the parade. She stopped it anyway. And I saw,